I think the approach has changed to target more mid-level ranking officials where there is clear evidence that they have been implicated in serious human rights violations. And I think in the case of Sri Lanka, really, given the pervasive climate of impunity, any such case, where you have strong evidence and where you have someone who is very much part and parcel of the system, where you can expose the nature of the violations and have someone of this nature stand trial in a UK court or in a court of another country would be a huge success in its own right, and would then also reinforce advocacy efforts in Sri Lanka itself. And that should not be forgotten. I mean, universal jurisdiction is not about using courts in the UK or former colonial country in that case, or in Western countries, but it's really part of a bigger effort, a joint effort, I would say, that takes place both at the national and the international level to hold the perpetrators accountable and to provide a measure of justice for the victims. So I think when thinking about such legal avenues, it's very important to keep the broader history of violations and impunity in mind, and really to be very targeted and to work together in order to also to avoid what happened in the Karuna case, and really to use the available avenues to make a difference. Thank you.
I think we all appreciate the point you made at the beginning, that there have been human rights violations and that there are victims on both sides of the conflict. At the same time, while there can be political and other discussion about the culpability of the Sri Lankan government on one side and the LTT on the other side, I think all of us here, and certainly speaking for myself as somebody who has come to this issue fairly recently, it's difficult not to be overwhelmed by the injustice that the Tamil people are facing, and it's the Tamil people who are absolutely on the receiving end of the grossest injustices in Sri Lanka. And so I think anybody who examines the conflict in Sri Lanka is struck to the core at how difficult things are for ordinary Tamil people in their own country. To discuss, for example, we all hear about the UN setting up a tribunal that examines human rights violations in Rwanda or in the former Yugoslavia. And given what we know about the horrendous human rights violations against Tamil people that have gone on and that are still going on in Sri Lanka, could you just explain to us a little bit, first of all, why somebody can't immediately set up a committee to examine those sorts of things? What's the legal process? And also we hear about something called the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Why is it not possible, for example, to just indict somebody for the violations that have happened in Sri Lanka? These might seem like obvious questions to international lawyers like yourselves, but for many of the people here, when you see the injustices, you might think, well, there must be a way. They do it in other countries, they do it in other situations. Can we do it in Sri Lanka, and what are the obstacles?
These are, by and large, political process, because if you look at the ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, they were set up by the UN Security Council. So again, you would need to have a majority in the Security Council in order to have such tribunals established. And there is little appetite for that these days. Yolanda has already mentioned that that the efforts in the UN Human Rights Council to have a strong resolution that calls for accountability for the crimes committed in Sri Lanka have failed. So that doesn't bode well for any further efforts to set up an international commission of inquiry. But this is essentially a political effort where the key international players would have to agree. I think there is some support given the the obstinate stance of the Sri Lankan government and the failure to engage with the international community to have such a commission of inquiry, but there is still a long way to go. What could happen if you have such an international commission of inquiry in place, and if it finds that serious violations have been committed, and then the Security Council would look into that again and would then be able to refer the case to the International Criminal Court, because Sri Lanka itself is not a party to the International Criminal Court statute. So it
has to be a signatory to the statute?
Yeah, so it's not a party. It's actually an international treaty. So Sri Lanka is not a party, so the International Criminal Court has no jurisdiction. The only possibility would be a referral by the Security Council, basically a Security Council telling the ICC start investigating and prosecuting. That has only happened once in the case of Darfur in Sudan, and it is highly unlikely that this will happen again, especially given China's and Russia's reluctance in this matter. So that's why I think, even though these mechanisms are available, I think it's rather hypothetical, but I would be very happy to be proved wrong on these issues.
In relation to the International Criminal Court, even if the Security Council were to refer the situation to the prosecutor, the International Criminal Court still functions by a notion of complementarity, which essentially means that if the Sri Lankan government were then to decide to prosecute or to open an investigation into these allegations, that the International Criminal Court would no longer have jurisdiction over the dispute. So it's essentially something that the Sri Lankan government can very much circumvent if it wishes to do so, to have jurisdiction in the International Criminal Court. And then, as my colleague has said, there are two other avenues for ad hoc tribunals. The first is similar to Rwanda and Yugoslavia, which is whereby the Security Council, acting under its powers under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, has the power to institute a tribunal of its own accord, and that has then got mandatory jurisdiction over these kinds of crimes. The UN is simply not going to bring about another one of these tribunals. They're widely regarded as a somewhat failed experiment in international law, because the greatest violations, certainly in Yugoslavia during that conflict, occurred after the inception of the tribunal and after the tribunal was already in operation. And it's also seen as a very intensive budgetary constraint which the state parties are no longer willing to fund. Then the final avenue whereby you could have an ad hoc tribunal having jurisdiction over this dispute would be the setting up of a hybrid tribunal, such as has happened in Sierra Leone and in Cambodia. However, in those cases, both Sierra Leone and Cambodia agreed with the UN to host a tribunal, and they are tribunals that are conducted under a hybrid of domestic law and international law. So again, highly contingent on the Sri Lankan government agreeing to jurisdiction.
It seems to be that political pressure on the Sri Lankan government is the number one feature that must come alongside legal remedies. And also, I know one of the things that has been of a real concern is the possibility of some form of process of truth and reconciliation going on inside Sri Lanka, because although as we stand at the moment the war is over, the conflict is over, there really can't, it would seem to be much constructive development unless there can be some form of process of truth and reconciliation. But that's very much an open debate. I mean, sorry, Lutz, would you like to go?
The warning light goes on for me if you mention truth and reconciliation, because I mean, I would be very interested in hearing your views on that. But I think in a country where there is an obvious breakdown of the rule of law and a complete lack of accountability and a lack of willingness, to even investigate serious violations, talk about truth and reconciliation can become very, very problematic, because it can be abused for political ends, really, and to perpetuate really the climate of impunity. So I think again one needs to be a bit wary when using these terms and looking at the process and how they have been used in various countries.